Let me then introduce my guests. First, Wyatt T. Walker, Chief of Staff of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and Executive Assistant to the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. Alan Morrison, New York editor of Ebony Magazine. Malcolm X, minister of Mosque Number 7 here in New York City, a leader in the Black Muslim Organization. And James Farmer, National Director of CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality.
Well, as a follower of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad and a Muslim, we believe that Mr. Muhammad has been raised by God to separate the so-called Negroes in this country from our former slave master and to lead us to a land of our own where we can stand on our own feet and solve our own problems. And because we religiously believe that it is intended, it is part of God's plan to separate the former slave, so-called Negro, from the former slave master, the American white man, we also believe that every effort to force integration upon the white man or to force the so-called Negro into the white society is actually in direct and divine opposition to God and will meet with bloodshed and destruction and no progress or benefit either to the so-called Negro or to the white man in this country.
I think perhaps we ought to turn to Malcolm X, who wanted to comment on that.
Yes, on this white power structure. When you say power structure, I know you mean the white power structure because that's all we have in America. And the white power structure today is just as much interested in perpetuating slavery as the white power structure was 100 years ago, only now they use modern methods of doing so. And realizing that the black people in this country are waking up and becoming filled with a desire to be looked upon as men and as human beings, the white power structure to slow down that struggle for freedom and human dignity uses tricks. 100 years ago they could do it with chains. Today they use tricks, and one of the tricks that they've invented is this token integration, to get Negro, so-called Negro leaders to accept a few token crumbs of integration that don't solve any problem for the masses of black people in this country whatsoever, but it does make the hand-picked Negroes be satisfied to slow down the cry of the masses. And a good example of that is as soon as the spirit of rebellion or revolution began to spread among the masses of black people in this country, and they began to take an active part, and they showed that they weren't confined to this nonviolent approach, then the government or the power structure began to sit up and take notice. And now, as you said earlier, the president is talking about new legislation and to put it, take it out of the streets and put it back in the courts. Why? As long as it's in the streets, it's in the hands of the masses of black people who will not compromise or who cannot be bought out. But when you put it back in the courts, then that puts it back into the hands of the hand-picked Negro leaders who will allow the judges and the other persons that are involved in this white power structure to slow them down. It's only a trick. And as long as the masses of black people are involved in the struggle for freedom, not integration, but freedom, and respect as human beings, respect as men, and show that they're willing to die to be respected as men, then the power structure sits up and takes notice. But as long as this mass element is led, and when I say led, I use led in quotes, actually contained by Uncle Tom Negro leaders who hold them back, who tell them turn the other cheek, and things like that, then the white power structure isn't worried at all. They're only worried when they know that the masses of black people are ready to explode, and in exploding it will destroy some of the furniture in their house, and then they react accordingly.
Mr. Morris? Well, let's send it back to the
Why
courts.
didn't he say this 3 years ago? Why didn't he say this when all of these sit-ins and freedom rides were very peacefully going on in the South and in other parts of the North? The man didn't say anything until he found out that black people in this country were ready to explode. And as soon as he saw that the explosion then was a threat to the white society, he came up with this mealy-mouthed speech, which is too late, and it's only a speech. We still don't see any actions that have stemmed from it. It's still only in the stage of words.
I think the speech is late, Minister Malcolm X, but not too late. No pronouncement that was that impressive and forthright from a president of the United States.
No one made a better pronouncement than Abraham Lincoln made 100 years ago, and that still hasn't been put into practice. It's still a pronouncement.
Sir, I applaud words.
Maybe that we'll have to see martial law declared in several areas throughout the South.
You mean a military dictatorship?
Well, I don't choose to describe it as.
It'll take a military dictatorship to bring black people and white people together in the same house. It'll take a military, if all of the token integration, which you've seen in the South, and it's only tokenism, and if this has caused the bloodshed that it has, what do you think white people, both North and South, will do on the basis of real integration? If you only ask for crumbs, and the granting of those crumbs causes bloodshed, what do you think will be caused when you ask for a loaf of bread or a bakery in which to bake your own bread?
Well, let me continue.
I'm sure for different reasons. But they were staying off the streets downtown. Nobody was buying. And if they can't make money out of the situation, then they want to do a rethink. Because they
needs to be done immediately. I don't think legislation alone can do it. And I do believe that...
How can you believe it's well-intentioned, then?
Well, I'm charitable enough to believe it's well-intentioned. I don't think it's realistic.
That's why we're still in the condition that we're in. Our leaders are too charitable toward those politicians who have been using flowery words but not coming up with deeds that will be equal to those words.
Sir, I think the real question is not whether they mean it, but what they do about it, whether they can pull it off.
President Kennedy is saying that he is urging upon the congressional branch of government, the legislative branch of government, what it is you have just said, that the federal government must seize upon this question now that it has been dramatized so successfully by what has happened.
But I think he knows full well that
you gentlemen would want.
But you can't compare the revolt of farmers with the revolt of black people in this country. Because if the farmers are revolting over more or less corn, which is in no way involves the Constitution or what this country is supposed to stand for, but the black man in this country is supposed to be getting freedom. The country is supposed to be based on that. Democracy, freedom, justice, equality, and all that stuff that they teach us in school. And now, why should the black man have to go to court to get freedom when a white man in this country is free when he's born? Why should the black man need some legislation to prove that he's a human being when you don't need any legislation to prove that whites are human beings? So I make this point because, to come right back to my initial statement at the outset of the program, you will never get real freedom and recognition between black and white people in this country without destroying the country, without destroying the present political system, without destroying the present economic system, without rewriting the entire Constitution. It'll be a complete destruction of everything that America supposedly stands for before a white man in this country will recognize a black man as something on the same level with himself. And this is why the Honorable Elijah Muhammad teaches us that the best way to solve the problem is complete separation. Let the black man, those of our people in this country who want to, have a country of our own where we can go and stand on our own feet and solve our own problems and not have to continue going to court or waiting for some politician to legislate for another 100 or 2 years to prove that we're human beings.
Mr. Moderator, I've discussed this with Minister Malcolm before, and after seeing Mississippi and Alabama close up, I'd be glad to give him those states if it were within my power to do so. Yet, as I think I've said before, Minister Malcolm, as I've said before, Minister Malcolm, the thing that bothers me about your idea of a black nation within a nation, presumably, if it can be effective then, is that if the white man hates us as much as you say he does, what a target that makes we were all together. All right.
His deeds.
Okay, well, now let's see. Okay, if he hates us that much, then I would hate to be all gathered in one place. I'd rather be dispersed throughout this nation. He could drop one controlled atom bomb and wipe us out. He could strangle us with a net of...
He's wiping you out.
He could strangle us.
Secretary
May I finish? He certainly did. But he could strangle us with an economic noose around our...
Negroes are strangled already.
All right.
Your own...
Gentlemen, I would rather be dispersed, Minister Malcolm, And I think then I would make a poor target. You know, if you're all together, one gun can shoot you.
Harlem is all
But if you're
together.
scattered.
Washington, D.C. has already become Washington, D.C. has already become an all-black city.
This is why Harlem is being strangled economically, I think, now, and this is why this summer we plan to have task force people, volunteers, working in key sections like Harlem.
The gentlemen are saying that we can expect this year to find some kind of massive economic
The year of '63
action.
is going to be a year of decision for America and for the Negro community.
There's talk also now, of course, in the papers today, on this day, of a massive march upon Washington. Do you feel that this will take place?
Conscientiously to end segregation and to create equality between Negroes and whites in America. But
Why then don't, if there are many whites who are trying to do this, why isn't more being done about it?
well,
Because what you're saying in essence is that the government is responsible for segregation, that the government is subsidizing segregation, that the government is the one that's actually instigating and carrying out this segregation that the politicians profess to be against.
Well, more should be done about it. Of course, I will readily grant that. But, and the second point, I think that the federal government is aiding and abetting the continuance of segregation in the South if it persists in making financial subsidies from public funds available to states which defy the courts of the land and which refuse to implement the ruling of the United States Supreme Court in 1954. I also want to point out as strongly as possible that that traditionally successive federal administrations have failed to tackle the problem of using coercive action, and I use that term in its constitutional context, against the segregationist Southern governments. And they have done it for political reasons.
All of the segregationist Southern governments are Democrats. You have a Democratic administration sitting in Washington, D.C.
But whoever practices it is still wrong.
But the point is, how can the Kennedy brothers, who are Democrats and are supposedly some of the strongest politicians in this country with political power, how is it that they cannot get their segregationist party members to go along with their program if the program of the segregationists differs from the program of the whites who are in power in Washington, D.C.?
Well, I don't think they should try very hard, because obviously there's a fundamental conflict.
They have to be in cahoots with each other.
Policy, philosophy, and ideology between the Democrats outside of the South and the Democrats in the South.
The Democrats in the North never condemn and disassociate themselves from the Democrats in the South. It is the Democrats in the South who defect from the party.
I wish to make one correction there. That was done in 1948 by President Harry Truman, who challenged the segregationist South and introduced and advocated a civil rights program which resulted in the secession from the Democratic Party. It was a temporary secession, mind you, but nevertheless it was a secession.
And was the civil rights program passed?
No, it wasn't.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I'd like to point out, Alan Morrison indicated, by using coercive means, either economic coercion or political coercion or what have you, or the type of coercion that we are using in the streets now. And I don't care whether this is done by a Democratic administration or a Republican administration. I don't think either one of them would be able to persuade or to convince Mississippi and Alabama to desegregate.
Mr. Farmer, why say the Deep South when Inglewood is not in the Deep South, New Rochelle is not in the Deep South, Chicago is not in the Deep South, and by your own admission, there is as much segregation practiced in the North as in the South, but it's done in a more subtle way. And the mistake that is made by many of our people who are in this so-called civil rights struggle, I have to say so-called civil rights struggle, is they always make a distinction between North and South. You don't find the black man in the South doesn't catch as much hell as the black man in the North. Only difference is the black man in the South knows where it is, and the black man in the North is being tricked every day by white liberals who grin in his face and pretend to be his friend, but at the same time is practicing segregation just as much as the white man in the South is practicing it.
Well, I don't know whether I could accept that altogether, Malcolm, because you live in the North predominantly, and I don't think you could speak for the experience that we as Southerners have. I think a Negro catches hell all over the country being a Negro, and I think we have said from our movement, I was speaking of Jim and the posture that Alan Morrison and I represent, that we say it is a national dilemma which has to be grappled with. It has different forms. I think in the South, it's not only emotional and psychological, but it's also physical. And I don't know whether you can put a slide rule to measure it. It's just a problem all over the nation, and we're on the threshold, I trust, of really grappling with it for the first time.
In the South, you're dealing with a wolf who lets you know where you stand. In the North, we're dealing with a fox who grins in our face and makes us think that we're getting some kind of freedom or that we're in a different place.
You are agreeing with me.
Yes, let me say that I don't think it's a fruitful discussion as to whether the thing is worse in the South or worse in the North. It's bad as anything, both places, all over the country. And it doesn't matter the shape that it takes one place or another. Now, we are in the streets in the North, in Inglewood, in California, in New York, just as we are in the streets in the South.
And then what has been accomplished?
What has been accomplished? What is being accomplished? Look at Philadelphia. Negroes are now being employed in
Negroes got it.
All right, 4, yes. And we are continuing our pressure.
There's a million Negroes in Philadelphia.
Now, let me tell you, Minister Malcolm, that we have gotten jobs for Negroes in Safeway's grocery stores, in Kroger's grocery stores, in department stores, in seal test dairies, in concern after concern. And not 4.
Mr. Farmer.
Not 40.
Whenever you have...
But they number in the hundreds.
Whenever you have thousands of Negroes demonstrating for jobs, as was demonstrated beautifully in Philadelphia, and then the leadership settled for 4 jobs, I can't see where that's progress.
Now, let me tell you, in our campaign against the leading dairy in New York, we did not settle for 4 jobs. We did not settle for 40 jobs.
The demonstrations in Philadelphia were settled for 4 jobs.
I'm not speaking of Philadelphia demonstration. I'm speaking of the dairy that we had a boycott against. We have more than 40 jobs already, and many more are coming. Now, we're after not a token employment. We're after full employment. I'd like to say a further word on the employment. 15 years. The gap has widened slightly, which means that if we are to achieve equality, we've got to find some way for the back wheels of the car to catch up to the front wheels of the car without a collision.
Go ahead. It means that the only time the black man in this country has made any progress was when in wartime. When the white man has his back to the wall, then he lets the black man come forward a little bit. And as soon as the war is over, he tells the black man, get back off me now. And I think, sir, with all due respect to you and the others who are here, when you sit and analyze the problem as it actually is and see the hypocrisy that has been practiced by whites when they talk this love talk and equality talk, sooner or later you'll be able to see that since we don't make any progress only during wartime, it'll take another war for the black man to take any more steps in the right direction.
Minister Malcolm?
And no, I didn't cut you off when you spoke there for 15 minutes. Moderator wouldn't let me. When you see the grit or the economic rut that our people are in, and as you point out and he points out, the union excludes us from them to keep us out, and if the union doesn't do it, management does it. We are caught in a grip between union, management, or I should say a conspiracy between the union, the management, and the government to keep us at the bottom of the economic ladder, the bottom of the housing ladder, the bottom of the educational ladder. And after experiencing that in a country for 100 years, I don't see how you could have any hope or confidence that this same race that has been doing it is not going to continue to do it, only in a different way with more 20th century or up-to-date or shrewd methods today than they had to use in the past.
You say that progress is achieved only in wartime.
It has only been achieved by
all right, now you say that. We're in a war now. We're in a war now. The war is being waged in the streets of Birmingham, the streets of Greensboro, the streets of Danville, Virginia.
That's not the war.
Now, wait a minute.
No,
this is the war.
That's not the war.
This is the war.
It's the result of the war. America is at war with Russia.
Let
me pursue the point. This is the Revolutionary War. The Revolutionary War was not finished at all. The Revolutionary War, 1776, provided independence and freedom in a sense for some Americans, but excluded black Americans. This is Revolutionary War Part 2, to take those beautiful words of the Declaration of Independence, of the preamble to the Constitution, and make them a reality for black people as well as white. Now, we are waging that war. If you don't like this war, That's all right.
No, wait a
But don't
minute.
deny that it is a war.
Malcolm X, may I interrupt at this point and just ask Mr. Walker, who is championing at the bit over here, for his comment?
Yeah, I wanted to buttress what Jim was saying about employment. I think the Philadelphia instance is one instance we would agree with, that it is a fair commentary. I would like to know what alternative do you propose is over against what we do?
That's a fair enough question. Let's wait for a break to get the answer. Malcolm X, I'm sure that you'll want to reply to Mr. Walker's question.
Yes, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad teaches us that after 400 years in this country, a country to which we've contributed our free labor, sweat, blood, we've given our lives to make it, or help make it what it is. And today, because the white man says that it's time now for us to get integration, or what he calls freedom, and many of the so-called Negroes who take him seriously and believe that what he says is he means it, they try and take advantage of it, and they end up getting beaten with police clubs or fire hoses or having dogs sicked upon them, simply because they believe what the white man says, that he intends for us to have freedom, justice, and equality. So Mr. Muhammad says, in the face of all of this, since we see that we just can't get justice here, and by justice I mean economic security, political security, social security, and so forth, the best solution is for the white man to allow the 20 million black people in this country to go back to our own home, those who want to go back to our own home and to our own people, and that the government itself should give us everything we need to go back to our own home and start life anew in our own land among our own people. And then if the government doesn't want to do that, since they don't want us to leave and they want us to stay here with them, we don't get along together, then Mr. Muhammad says the best solution is to separate part of the country here and give us a place to ourselves where we can then go and set up our own agricultural system, our own economic system, and try and do something to provide food, clothing, and shelter, and the things that our people need in order to live. In other words, give us a chance to solve our own problem among ourselves on some land of our own, instead of continually trying to force us into white society, where the white society knows we're absolutely not wanted, and a white society which knows it will never accept its ex-slave on the same level with itself as something equal with itself.
Well, of course, this kind of separatism harks back, I think, to something that Mr. Farmer said before that I'd like to pick up, too. It isn't, Mr. Farmer said, I suspect he would not want to equate it.
The Negro makes a gain. The gain starts as of now.
But isn't this something less?
Because the Negro didn't make the gain. See, as long as someone is giving you something, he can always take it back. And this is the mistake this is where our people are making the mistake. We are sitting, waiting for whites.
Nobody gives the Negro anything.
I don't mean it in that sense. Either in court or out of court, we've been sitting and waiting for the man to give us some concessions. Now, whenever you ask if you're asking the white power structure for jobs, that's only a temporary solution. If you ask the white power structure for housing, that's a temporary solution. As Mr. Farmer said, where the Negro used to ask for equality, now he's asking for more. He's asking for more than equality. Well, likewise, if they give us more than equality, 10 years from now, we're going to be asking for more than that, because the problem has still not gotten a real solution.
Mr. Moderator.
Just one moment, let me finish what I'm going to say. As long as we accept a temporary solution, the problem will go unsolved. It'll be solved for you and me right now, but not for our children. If the black nations in Africa, most of which have a less number of educated Africans than exist among black people in this country, yet they can establish their own independent nations and try and create a future for their people, then Mr. Muhammad says, here in America, there are enough black people who profess to be educated, and with all this talk about equality with the white man, if we're equal with the white man, why can't we separate from him and set up our own government and go for ourselves and solve our own problems?
Mr. Farmer, if we can stick for a moment to this notion of compensatory action, I really think that we ought to work on this one for a moment, because it still seems to me, and it probably does seem to a number of people,
which have been similarly discriminated against, though not for so long a period of time as Negroes.
Puerto Ricans weren't enslaved. This is a problem that stems from slavery. And this compensation, yes, sir, this compensation is coming to people who were enslaved by the white man for 400 years. The Puerto Ricans don't even fit into this picture.
Well, they do fit into it.
No,
they do fit into it.
The problem is the Negro problem. They're not lynching Puerto Ricans.
If a dark-skinned Puerto Rican went down to Mississippi, he probably would be lynched too.
Spanish, he wouldn't be lynched.
No, they don't.
It's the Negro here, and as long as he can speak Spanish or some other language, or if he ties his head up with a turban or something, he can go anywhere in Mississippi or in your home that he desires.
You're not aware of the fact, are you, that African students have been arrested in our demonstrations in the South?
When they
speak French.
When they have been mistaken for the so-called Negro in America, they've been arrested.
What I'm saying is that many Puerto Ricans are mistaken for Negroes. I do not think discrimination stems only from slavery.
Let me turn to Mr. Walker.
I wanted you say that Mr. Farmer's idea of compensatory treatment of the Negro has portents of disaster. It does have portents of disaster for the system from which the Negro community is suffering. And over against that, I don't think Malcolm X's analogy of the nations in Africa and Asia that are freeing themselves, you have there on the one hand a black or brown majority, whereas the Negro community in America is a black or brown minority. And I don't think the analogy quite holds water, and this is why we...
But your whole philosophy comes out of India. This nonviolent thing is based upon the 400 million Indians doing passive sit-down on 100,000 whites, and you use that. Well, in this country, you're still a minority, yet you're going to use tactics that was used by a dark minority in another land.
I think this shows how little you know about nonviolence, because Gandhi began his campaign among the Indians in South Africa, who are a minority.
And they're still they're still a minority, and they still have the problem. But Gandhi's fame came from having gotten freedom for the people of India from the English, and he used non-violent methods, which means you have a great big dark elephant-type creature sitting down on a little white mouse. But here in America, you have a little black mouse trying to pull a sit-down, non-violent tactic on a
Let me pursue this, Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead, just for a minute, and then I'll exercise non-violent methods to enforce a break. Just go ahead.
Nonviolence is more effective when you have large numbers of people. That is what we found out in Birmingham. It's what we found out all over North Carolina.
What did you gain in Birmingham?
Now, wait a minute. Let me tell you what we've gained in North Carolina.
What did you gain in Birmingham?
Let me tell you what we've gained there. He can answer that. This was his campaign in Birmingham. Ask me about our campaign.
What did you gain in North Carolina?
Let me tell you what we've gained. We've gained jobs. We've gained open employment in Greensboro, North Carolina. One of the officials of the city who is in charge of employment has announced that hereinafter all city employment will be on a merit basis and there'll be no discrimination. A committee has been set up whereby grievances of individuals who feel that they've been discriminated against because of race will be dealt with. We are represented on that committee. In 6 cities in North Carolina, the theaters have desegregated. Places that serve the public in 5 cities have desegregated. And the whole state is becoming an open state. Now, wait a minute.
Is it a gain to go to a theater for a man who hasn't got a job?
It's a gain to get a job. It's a gain to get a job, and it's jobs that we're providing. Now, it's a gain also to go to the theater. It's a gain because it's not the theater so much, it's not the cup of coffee at the lunch counter. It's the dignity that a person achieves. Is it a gain to have a business over on the other side of the tracks to which you can go, but when you walk downtown, you're discriminated against and cannot go there?
It's a gain.
What I say, Mr. X, is that all places that serve the public, black and white, must serve all members of the public. We are members of the public, whether you want to admit it or not. If we're not members of the public, then what are we?
Why do you have the race problem in this country if we're members of the public?
We're members of the public, and that's why we are trying to wipe out racial discrimination.
You'll never wipe it out with a desegregated theater.
Well, I
We're
may
wiping
not,
it
I
out
guess,
with
but
jobs.
may I, however, ineffectually, over the past 60 seconds, try to have a break now, and we'll be back in just a moment.
Overall culture. Negroes increasingly are finding something in their background, their heritage, their culture to contribute. This, I think, is the future of America.
Malcolm X, I wonder whether you can accept the notion that a white man is no more responsible for his skin than is a man who is black.
If he's not responsible for his skin, he is responsible for his deeds. And collectively, the white people in this country are guilty today and must accept the blame for the collective criminal act that was committed against black people by bringing our people to this country. And if it is not the whiteness of his skin, for which the Honorable Elijah Muhammad teaches us that he's entering into condemnation today, it is his deeds, and you can't hardly separate his deed from his skin. The country that has been established here has been established by white people for the benefit of white people. The economic system, the political system, the educational system of America has been set up primarily for the benefit of white people. Our people were brought here in chains, forcibly, not on the Mayflower, but in slave ships, to add to the American economy, and we've been exploited politically, economically, and otherwise ever since.
And many of these same white people, Malcolm X, are attempting now to change that structure, to change what it is that you say. I think that there are very few, there's no one at this table, and there are very few people I know who would deny the validity of much that you describe, but the potential for the future, the potential not for the distant future, but for the here and now. And I turn to Mr. Walker and ask him whether in his own activities in the South now, which is so real, and have achieved certain things, whether they haven't been achieved, these achievements haven't been made with the assistance, North and South,